Women in Victorian England. Breaking the stereotype. The 17th century poet John Milton believed in the essential inferiority of women. In Book 8 of his epic poem Paradise Lost, he tells Adam, the first man according to the Bible, that Eve, the first woman, is thy likeness, thy fit help, thy other self, thy wish exactly to thy heart's desire. That is, the woman exists purely in order to please the man. Coventry Patmore, in his epic poem The Angel in the House, written in the middle of the 19th century, models his description of the ideal wife on Milton's Eve, before she takes the apple, of course, saying, "Man must be pleased, but him to please is woman's pleasure." Of course, this idea that the purpose of a woman is to please a man is exactly the same sort of thing that Mary Wollstonecraft objected to in the writings of the French philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau towards the end of the 18th century. Coventry Patmore isn't saying anything new in his poem, but somehow it's come to be the first thing that comes into many people's minds when they think about Victorian women. If you are anything like me, you have probably heard people going on about Coventry Patmore's poem The Angel in the House enough times to drive you crazy. Okay, yes, it's true. He did write that poem. But that doesn't mean we have to keep going on and on about it, does it? Apart from anything else, it's a very bad poem, and most of the people who repeat the title probably couldn't recite a line of the contents. Let's just take it for granted that Victorian women were supposed to play an idealised role in the domestic sphere, and move on, shall we? It's a stereotype. And like all stereotypes, it has a grain of truth, but it can block us from looking more deeply and seeing the complicated reality. According to the 1851 census, the population of the United Kingdom was 27.5 million people. How many of those were women, do you suppose? And how many of those women fitted the stereotype of angels in the house? A census was taken every 10 years during the 19th century. Analysis of the census statistics gives a detailed insight into population, employment, and other aspects of Victorian society. According to the 1851 census for England and Wales, the top 6 jobs, in terms of the numbers of workers, were 1,790,000 agricultural workers, of whom 227,000 were women, 1,039,000 workers in domestic service, most of whom, 905,000, were women, 527,000 textile workers, of whom more than half were women, 443,000 workers in the building industry, only 1,000 of whom were women, 376,000 general labourers, again, only 9,000 of whom were women, and 340,000 female workers in the dressmaking industry, along with just 500 men. Out of over 4.5 million workers in these main areas, over 1.75 million were women. That's nearly 40%. Victorian women were active in every area of employment. There were also female coal miners, 3,000 out of a total of 219,000, and blacksmiths, 600 out of 112,000. And the small proportion of women employed in fields like agriculture and building needs to be set against the fact that many of them were the wives of agricultural workers and builders. Far from being angels of the house, most women were either out working alongside the men in harsh conditions and, usually, for lower wages, or were housewives in working-class families struggling to feed their children and support their husbands at home. In sum, the 1851 census revealed that 3 million women, half of the 6 million adult women in England, were working, and 2 million of them were also married. This image that they were sitting around playing the harpsichord and drinking tea elegantly is completely inappropriate to the vast majority of Victorian women. Another challenge to the stereotype of the angel in the house is the prevalence of prostitution in Victorian society. W.O. Daniel, Ins and Outs of London, 1859, estimates that there were about 55,000 prostitutes in London alone at that time, out of a population of some 2,200,000 people. That's one prostitute for every 40 people. William Acton, Prostitution Considered in its Moral, Social and Sanitary Aspect, estimated the number much lower, at around 8,000. But most scholars think O'Daniel's figure is more likely to have been accurate. The Society for the Suppression of Vice put the figure even higher, at 80,000. Whatever the exact figures were, it's clear that prostitution was taking place on a huge scale. Members of the armed forces were discouraged from marrying, as were, among others, clergymen and university professors, and prostitution was their main sexual outlet. Even for married men, visiting a prostitute was considered a fairly normal part of life. Prostitution was not illegal, and respectable women were not expected to regard sexual intercourse as, in any way, pleasurable.
Lie back and think of England.
Attitudes towards prostitutes veered between condemning them and pitying them. In Dickens's novels, for example, they generally meet a bad end, like Nancy in Oliver Twist, which seems like a punishment for their sins. But in real life, he helped to found Urania House, a place where fallen women could reform themselves and live a virtuous life. There are other things that Dickens possibly did in relation to fallen women in real life that I'll perhaps come back to in another podcast. One thing we can be clear about is that the angel of the house existed more often in the heads of Victorian men than in their houses. It's also obvious that there were many kinds of women in Victorian society, both in the domestic sphere and in the public sphere. We need to understand the variety of women and the different circumstances of their lives, and not imagine that they all fit into one particular stereotype. Changes in attitudes towards women and in the legal status of women were going on all through the 19th century. We need to check carefully on the actual position at the time that any particular piece of writing was written and published. There were many changes during the course of the 19th century. Reforms specifically affecting women start to kick in the late 1830s. Let's take a look at some of them. In 1839, the Child Custody Act gives mothers limited rights of access to their children in case of divorce or separation. In 1842, it becomes illegal for women and young children to work underground in coal mines. Queen's College for Women was founded in 1848, the first of a number of schools for girls that for the first time offered an education comparable to that available to boys. During the Crimean War of 1854-56, Florence Nightingale developed hospitals and nursing facilities. The first swimming pool for women is opened in 1858, and the Nightingale School of Nursing was founded in 1860. In 1865, girls were admitted to Cambridge local examinations. In the same year, Elizabeth Garrett Anderson becomes the first woman doctor. and the Women's Suffrage Committee was founded. 2 years later, in 1867, the first Women's Suffrage Bill, arguing that women should have the right to vote, was presented to Parliament. Josephine Butler opened the first industrial home, giving former prostitutes a chance to find legitimate work, in 1867. Girton College, the first women's college at Cambridge, was opened in 1869. The first Married Women's Property Act, giving women the right to keep property earned or inherited when they married, was passed in 1870. The Infant Custody Act, giving mothers greater rights to custody over their children, was passed in 1872. London Medical College for Women opened in 1874. Women were admitted to degree courses at the University of London in 1878. Women who were repeatedly abused were allowed to separate from their husband in the same year. The second Married Women's Property Act, giving women the right to keep possession of property acquired after they marry, was passed in 1882. And the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies was founded in 1898. Let's think for a minute about what some of that means. Before 1878, women had no right to divorce violent and abusive husbands. And if their husbands divorced or left them, they had only limited rights of access to their own children, and before 1839, they didn't even have those limited rights. Until 1870, they had no right to personal property. Everything they had belonged to their husband. When Queen Victoria came to the throne, women couldn't open a bank account, go to university, become a doctor or a lawyer or a banker. By the time she died, they could. With all these changes taking place, we need to be careful when we talk about Victorian women or 19th century women. At the beginning of the century, married women were effectively the property of their husbands, with no rights to individual property or to divorce or even to take legal action on their own behalf. By the end of the century, women had still not achieved full equality with men, but they had considerably more rights, greater access to education, and better employment prospects than their grandmothers. And that happened thanks largely to the determination of women themselves. Without the actions of women like Caroline Norton, Josephine Butler, Barbara Bodichon, Emily Davies, Millicent Fawcett, and Emmeline Pankhurst, the feminist revolution, and I think that's not too strong a word to describe the change in attitudes over the last 200 years, would never have taken place. But that's a topic for another day. Thank you for listening. The Anno Sensei channel covers a wide range of educational topics, mainly focusing on English language, literature, and history. If you enjoyed this presentation, don't forget to subscribe and, if you're able, sign up as a channel member.